Welcome to the Townsend Marine Science Center lecture series, The Future of Oceans. This is the beginning of year 11. I just want to thank people who have made this series possible over the last 10 years by introducing us to really wonderful speakers and who have supported the series in lots of other ways, or been speakers themselves, some of whom are in this room. And I'd like to thank the Darrow family for their ongoing support of the series. Their support makes it possible for us to offer admission at no charge, which is really a great thing for us. So thank you very much to Dan and Susie and their family. That we at the Marine Science Center work on the traditional tribal lands of many Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Sklallam people, the Strong people. We respect and are grateful for this land and these waters, and the people who have inhabited them since time immemorial and who continue to steward this place for future generations. I have the great pleasure of introducing Greg Jensen today. Greg is many things and not in any particular order, but he's a fisheries biologist specializing in crustaceans with a PhD from UW. He is a lifelong diver, photographer, turtle keeper with his wife Pam, who is also a crab biologist. And he's also faculty at University of Washington in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences, where he coordinates the capstone project. So since 2007, he's been mentoring students in their senior research projects. He's also involved with Reef Environmental Education Foundation, which is an organization that coordinates citizen science projects with the dive community, the local dive community, to collect data and do survey work. In addition to his many scientific publications and publications for lay people, his photographs have been published in lots of places, including the Seattle Times, BBC Magazine, C Magazine, my personal favorite, Weekly Reader, and his photographs have been in exhibits or used in museums like Odyssey Maritime Center, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Oregon Coast Aquarium. But we know him from his books because we use his books and we have his books in our store. And so the three that are over there are Crabs and Shrimp of the Pacific Coast, now in a new, lovely expanded edition. Beneath Pacific Tides and Nudibranchs and Sea Slugs of the Eastern Pacific. And these are more than ID guides. These are comprehensive field guides that were really created for not just divers, but for everyone who wants to have a closer look at the rich biodiversity of life in the Salish Sea. So please help me in welcoming Greg Jensen.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Diane. Actually, I don't know how you did your research, but you came up with photo things that I'd long forgotten. I'm impressed. Well, thank you all for turning out today, missing the Seahawks game to hear about crabs and shrimps. Last time I checked, you weren't missing much. What I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about how crabs and shrimps are not necessarily what people think they are. We all appreciate them, or most of us appreciate them for their taste and stuff like that. But we also have certain perceptions about what these things do for a living. And it turns out that not just lay people and their perceptions of what these things do, also scientists don't realize quite how integrated these guys are in the ecosystem. So this is from a scientific paper showing supposedly the role of crabs and shrimps in an ecosystem. So these are the crabs, these are the shrimps, and of course the lines are, shows them detritus. Detritus is basically decomposing organic material, so breaking down little particles of algae and stuff like that. So that's showing as a main component of the decapod's diet, and also of the shrimp. And you don't really see much else. You got some macroalgae going to these guys, but that's it. And then you've got, of course, well, they're fish food. Yeah, they are. But as we'll see, we're going to see a lot of extra stuff going on in this diagram by the time we get to the end. So a crab that pretty well fits that description that's in there, though, would be our local little shore crabs you find under just about every rock at low tide, something like the yellow shore crab. And these guys are omnivores, spend a lot of time scouring the surface of rocks. This is a little video clip of, it's called a striped shore crab. You won't find it right here, but you will find it on the outer coast. It's a California species that over the last couple decades has expanded up into Washington and British Columbia as waters have warmed. But as you'll see, picking away at the surface of the rocks, they have spoon-shaped tips on these claws. They're very good at scraping things. And so little microalgae and stuff like that, they're constantly picking. And these guys do this out of water, but our guys do this when the tide's in. And you can imagine any kind of little newly settled barnacle or mussel or something like that that's on that rock face is also perfectly good grub for these guys as well. Here are some Hemigrapsis working on a salmon head that was discarded at a boat launch. And so these are playing into kind of the usual perception that people have for what these things do for a living, right? You ask people what do crabs eat, and they're like, they're scavengers. It's easy to get that impression when you see something like this. Here are some red rock crabs and Dungeness crabs that are working on part of a discarded salmon carcass. Again, scavengers. What do we do when we want to catch crab? We put fish heads in a crab pot, right? And they come and get it, right? But stop and think about it. How often do fish heads just show up in nature, right? Other than what somebody discards. Making a living as a scavenger is a tough way to make a living. If you think about scavengers on land, what do you come up with? Well, something like vultures that are able to cover vast distances flying around, right? Or something like a little Arctic fox that's going to shadow a polar bear and take advantage of what's left over after it eats its fill. But as far as things just up and dying, it doesn't happen that often. If a fish gets eaten, it's usually swallowed whole by a bird, swallowed whole by another fish, that kind of thing. So what do these guys do for a living? Oh, I should say, Finding Nemo, of course, adds to this perception as well, where you got these guys hanging out on the sewer pipe going, manna from heaven, So I used to teach a class up at Bamfield, on the west side of Vancouver Island, Marine Station up there, crustacean biology class, and on the first day of class I mentioned something about, crabs don't get no respect. And that stuck with the students so much that at the end of the quarter, when it came time to put make a class t-shirt, that's what got immortalized. And it's because people perceive them as these bottom feeders, right? These things that are hanging out at sewer pipes and eating discarded fish heads. But really, if we look at what they're eating out in the field, they're actually predators for the most part. So here's a graceful crab. This is a little cancer crab that looks much like a Dungeness but doesn't get as large, oftentimes mistaken for a small Dungeness crab. And this one has opened a mussel here and is almost finished eating it. Much of the diet of these animals consists of hard-shelled prey like this. And here is a helmet crab that is eating a frilled dogwinkle. And you can see how it's just kind of chipped away and peeled back around the spiral until it's getting to the meat of the snail inside. even the biggest snail we have around here, moon snails, if you've ever seen them, you know, this shell can be softball sized or bigger, and you got this massive foot, right? It's actually got a lot of water in it that they have to squeeze out in order to get into the shell. It takes them a couple minutes to do it, but they can get that all inside the shell. Well, then, you know, who would they have to do this for? I mean, you know, they're so big. Does anybody actually eat these things, right? Well, here's one that is squeezed back into its shell. You can see something has chipped away most of the aperture and chipped back here. Almost got past the operculum, the little trap door that it uses to block the opening. But whatever was doing this got spooked by something else or whatever and gave up just as it was about to succeed in getting this guy. So this is a very lucky snail. Here's a very unlucky snail. And you can see, same as like what that helmet crab was doing, just peeling back around the spire until it gets to where it can access the meat inside. So as you can probably guess, the culprit in this is the red rock crab. These guys are, I call them the wrecking ball of crabs that we have around here. They got these massive claws. You don't want to mess with these guys. They can literally take your finger off. And these animals have had a profound impact on molluscan prey. So here's one actually working on a moon snail, and he's actually got it chipped back to where he's getting past the operculum. So if we take a look at one of the more common large snails we have around here, the frilled dogwinkle, has this name frilled because it oftentimes has these noticeable frills on it. Very common intertidal snail. When people first started describing snails from this area, they would find ones like this, and so they gave it one name, and then they find something that was a little different, and they'd give it another name, because these are really variable in color, and they're also very variable in morphology. So this is the same species, but you see this doesn't have any frills, and look at the thickness of the aperture here. This is not a genetic difference. This is what we call phenotypic plasticity. And what this is this is from an area where there's lots of those big, nasty red rock crabs that can break into shells. And so what the animal has done is it's thickened its aperture to make it much more difficult for that crab to sit there and chip and peel and get back at the snail. If you take this snail and put it in a tank downstream from the smell of a red rock crab, it will start thickening up its aperture. So that's why we call it phenotypic plasticity. It's not a genetic difference. It's something that the animal is doing in response to the presence of the predator. Well, these crabs have influence on things other than just snails, too. Also on bivalves, on the clams that we go out and dig. So here's a red rock crab that's in the process of digging up a clam. And these animals can get at very deep burrowing clams. If any of you have ever dug horse clams, you know that they are quite some distance underneath the ground. They will actually excavate a big pit to get to that clam. Here's a red rock crab digging a clam. This is on a beach that I've tried to dig clams at, and man, it is hard work because of all the rocks. And you can see he's trying to bulldoze all these rocks out of the way. They're very persistent. You have to keep in mind, these crabs, they basically can taste with their feet. So if you look at the dactyls on a red rock crab, you'll see all these little bristles along the edge of them. And those are actually sensory hairs that they taste with. So if they're walking across the bottom and they step on a clam siphon that's sticking out of the dirt, they immediately taste clam. And it's like, okay, if I'm in the mood for clam, start digging, right? Amazing amount of work that these things will go to excavate like this, but eventually it will probably get to that clam. Here's one that has dug up a butter clam, and I took this picture right over here underneath the Marine Station dock at Fort Worden. So he's excavated this very large butter clam, and now he's going to work on breaking into it. Here are a couple of them working on, looks like a horse clam. that one of them managed to dig up. And they're actually playing very nice. See, they're being quite polite. And now we got, a bigger one coming in here. And it's like, hey guys, what do you got here? And he's checking it out. And, I guess I don't want any. Just carry on. Crabs can be nasty, but they can also play nice. So what's really cool, though, is if we look at the distribution of mollusks, of bivalve mollusks on beaches, there's this really cool pattern that emerges, and it's all kind of driven by these crabs that are coming up and digging things up. So cross-section of the beach here, high intertidal, middle, and low to subtidal, so areas where they're never exposed by the tide. If we look at where the clams are, the little neck clams, called little neck because they got a little siphon, really short. If you've ever dug them, you know they're just like right underneath the surface of the sediment. You get to the middle of the intertidal, you get something like that butter clam you just saw. Clam is farther down in the sediment, it's got a longer neck, can reach up. Get down to the lowest parts, the horse clams or gapers, gooey ducks. How many here have ever dug a gooey duck? You know. These things can be 3 feet down. So the sole defense of these things is to retract their neck, right? When you go to dig one of these gooey ducks, it's not digging away from you. By the time it's an adult, it doesn't even have a foot to dig with. It just retracts its neck, and you're just trying to get down to it before the sides of the thing collapse or whatever. And it's the same with these other guys. On the outer coast where you have razor clams, yes, those do actually dig away from you. They're fast diggers. But all these other clams, their only defense is to pull their neck in, close their shell. Well, if you look at a little neck clam, when it closes its shell, it pulls that siphon in and closes up, and it's tight. There's no opening at all. A butter clam, because it has to live a little deeper in the sediment, have a longer siphon, there's a little bit of a gape here, and that's a vulnerability. So if a crab digs it up, this gives him something he can get his claw into, break away, or might be a little bit of neck still sticking out. Gapers, as the name implies, the shell's got this huge gape because it's got to accommodate that siphon. And gooey duck, the shell is no protection at all on these last two, really, because they've got so much meat just hanging out. So here are a couple of gooey ducks and a horse clam, and that's all the farther they can get their necks in right there. So once they're dug up, they're totally vulnerable. So their whole defense is to go underground like this. So the crabs only have a limited amount of time, since they're working at high tides, and usually at night high tides, because they have their own predators they have to avoid. So the little neck clams, sure, it only takes them a few minutes maybe to dig one up, but they can only do it on certain tides when they can get up there and dig them up and then run back down before they get stranded by the tide themselves. And so you end up with this really cool association of longer necks as you go deeper and deeper. So here's one that has gone up in the intertidal. It's gotten this little neck clam. It's down in the subtidal now, and it'll literally pinch that shell repeatedly, sometimes hundreds of times, making little micro cracks, eventually cause a failure of that shell, and it can get in. So here's a gooey duck siphon. So this is really all you're seeing at the surface of these things. And you've got this huge mass of meat, very nutritious meat, hanging out way underneath the dirt, right? Crabs, by digging these things up, are making a resource available to a bunch of other animals, because a red rock crab digs up a horse clam or a gooey duck. It can't eat that whole thing. It can only eat a small portion of it. But as soon as he digs that up, he starts getting help from others. And a lot of times their fish and things like that will be right there to get the scraps. And so by excavating these deep burrowing bivalves, these crabs are making all these resources available to these animals that are living on, it's basically an open featureless bottom that might not have that much stuff to eat right on the surface. This is a Dungeness crab that has opened a mussel has been working on it. But just to give you an idea of how, you become very popular when you bring some of this stuff up. You got all these shiner perch here. It's like, oh, yeah, I'll have a piece of that. And they're helping themselves. And now you got a flatfish, a little sand dab coming in at the bottom there, checking it out. And here comes a ratfish. So, it's like eat as fast as you can. Oh, here comes a bigger Dungeness crab. So that was just a little mussel. So imagine you pull up a gooey duck or a horse clam, right? It's feast time for a lot of other animals. So they're playing a bigger role than people acknowledge and recognize in the system, just in this alone. So we mentioned the wrecking ball, red rock crab. Here's one eating barnacles off a piling. You can see all the barnacle scars and bases here as he's just like eating these like you'd eat peanuts, right? Cracking the shell, popping them in his mouth. And again, think to basic marine ecology and how sessile organisms like barnacles and mussels and everything compete for space, right? These guys are serving a super valuable function, kind of like what you so often hear about starfish, clearing space that allows a higher diversity of other things to settle, right, into an area. So by freeing up space like this, now there's room for maybe algae or mussels or something else besides barnacles to be on there. Okay, this next video is going to be a little disturbing, but as a preamble to it, I'll explain what it's showing, other than just a cloud of dust here. So I was out on a night dive at Discovery Bay, and I saw this red rock crab walking along. He'd walk for a little ways, and then he'd pounce and kind of probe the bottom a little bit, and he'd pick up and walk a little ways. And crabs, when they're hunting things, they walk forward. So people have this perception that crabs only walk sideways, right? But they can walk forward, they can walk back. When they're just out strolling, they're usually walking forward. So I watched him do this several times, and he didn't seem to come up with anything, and I went on my way. And a little bit later in the dive, I came across another one that was doing the same thing, and I came upon him right as he, as you'll see, scored. He's grabbed this good-sized rock sole, and he's basically just crushed its head. And of course, he saw me there and thought I was going to try to take it from him, so he went sprinting off. There's some spot prawns kind of getting out of the way there. And if you look in the scientific literature, red rock crabs just eat clams and snails and that sort of thing. It's always assumed that these animals that are kind of big and clumsy and slow, are just feeding on hard-shelled things that can't run away. And as you can see, they're perfectly capable of taking down very mobile organisms. A lot of these fish at night are just laying there on the bottom asleep. And so basically that's, opportunity for them to ambush. So now I'm showing you an octopus, and you're like, what's up with this guy? We came here to hear about crabs. Just bear with me for a sec. This is an octopus I came across in the Bahamas on a night dive. And it's doing something that we call speculative feeding. So he's dashing across a seagrass bed, and then he stops and he flares out the webbing on his arms. He basically turns himself into this big cast net, right? And once he's got that in place, then he's probing underneath with the ends of his tentacle, or his arms, and any little fish, shrimp, whatever it might be in that patch of grass, he's got it already entrapped. And as you'd follow them, you'd see occasionally, like this kind of boom is, something trying to get away would hit the webbing, and stuff. And our local octopus, GPO, the giant Pacific octopus, does the same thing. And like I say, it's called speculative feeding because, he doesn't know that there's something there. He's basically, just testing it out. So GPOs will go up to a rock and just envelop it and probe and feel if there's something underneath, and they've got it already contained. And that's what the crab was doing, right? As it was walking along and pouncing, and walking along and pouncing, is doing what we would call speculative feeding. This is a northern kelp crab. Northern kelp crab is one of the most common crabs we see around here, and the name kelp crab is very applicable because they really like to eat kelp, and they hang out on bull kelp, and near the end of the summer and fall and winter, as the rate of kelp growth slows down, the rate of crabs eating kelp doesn't really, and so they kind of out-eat their food supply. So here's a bull kelp stipe with the bulb, and all the blades are gone, and the crabs are still on it. And once the kelp's gone, then they'll go down and start feeding on barnacles and mussels and stuff to tide them through the winter. But again, they're either herbivorous, right, eating kelp, or they're eating, barnacles and mussels, which don't really run away. Well, here's a octopus that was on its way out, undoubtedly, but getting drawn and quartered or drawn and octoed by a bunch of different kelp crabs that each have. So this octopus was still alive at this point. It's a very horrible way to go. But they also really like jellyfish. So you'll see them on pilings, and they'll latch onto any passing jellyfish, and then they'll mob onto it, or like this one's caught this one and has it all to himself. But they also do this speculative feeding. So I've watched them where they walk along and pounce on patches of algae and kind of probe it, and then go on and pounce on another patch of algae. So even though normally they would be eating algae, they're like, for some reason, they're pouncing and not eating it. On a number of occasions, I've seen, I shouldn't say number, a couple times, I've seen them eating live gunnels, which hang out in patches of algae. So what they're doing is speculative feeding by trying to catch fish unawares by jumping on the hidey place that the fish has. Here's one that has caught a pipefish and has already eaten maybe a fifth of the animal, and the poor fish is still alive as he's munching away from the tail end. Again, these are perceived by pretty much everybody as being too slow and clumsy to ever feed on a fish, and yet, it's probably a fairly common occurrence because in the brief times I'm underwater, I've seen it. It's got to be going on quite a bit. So here's our friend, the graceful crab. So another thing that these catch by doing this speculative feeding is smaller crabs. And this is a case of cannibalism here, because this is a baby graceful crab that has just been grabbed by this guy. I mean, I was lining up pictures just to take a portrait of the crab, and all of a sudden it just sort of pounced toward me and pulled this little guy out of the sediment. And just in the course of like a minute and a half, he basically completely takes this little guy apart and eats him. Here's a red rock crab that's killed a female red rock crab and ripped off her abdomen and is eating the eggs she was carrying. So again, pretty nasty predators. Here's a graceful crab that's killed a shore crab. And a lot of times when crabs kill other crabs to eat them, they'll leave this kind of characteristic semicircle taken out of the rear of the carapace. So if you look at a crab, there's kind of a seam along the back here where the crab is the difference between the carapace and the abdomen, and it's kind of where the crab backs out when it molts and all that kind of thing. Well, it's also a handy place for a predator to kind of slide his thumb under there and pop the top on the crab. And so when you find crab shells with this mark on them, you can kind of assume that it was done by a larger crab. These clams, even really heavy-duty clam shells that close pretty well, can still get breached by these guys. So here's a Himalaya that's been eaten by a crab. Again, chipped away the shell to get at what's inside, as opposed to a shattered shell that you'd see from something like a seagull dropping it on the rocks or whatever. So all of these kinds of forensic sorts of things, you can, if you want to know more about it and brush up on it, tune in to CSI Crab Scene Investigation, Sundays at 9 p.m. on CBS. So getting back to our diagram then, you know, where we have our decapods, right, the crabs and shrimps here, and how little they seem to be engaged with other things. Now we see they eat bivalves, they eat snails, they eat worms, they eat shrimp, and they eat fish, right? This was my opening slide, my title slide, and I tossed it in here again because it shows kind of what I'm talking about in terms of, you know, here's a red rock crab that's clearing barnacles off a rock, and these dock shrimp are taking advantage of the remnants of these barnacles and scarfing up on them. So that brings us to the shrimp part of the talk here. What are these shrimp doing? And again, what do we do when we want to catch shrimp? We put a fish head in a shrimp pot and drop it in deeper water than where the crabs are. But again, is that what these things actually do for a living? Nah. So this is one type of shrimp. It's very common around here. There's a bunch of different species in this genus Crangon, and kind of a little different body design than what you're accustomed to for a shrimp, more of a flat, squat body design. And they typically are found on muddy or sandy bottoms. And these guys are super important as food for Dungeness crabs, for fish, and even for harbor seals. It's one of the first things that newly weaned harbor seals feed on before they can catch fish. So this is a Crangon on some sand. It's going to bury itself, so don't blink or you're going to miss it. This is really, really fast. And it's not, looks sped up, but it's not. Again, lots of things eat these guys, so they need to be able to conceal themselves really well. Here he is once he's buried. There's his eyes. And of course, being buried, you still have to breathe, so he's got this little respiratory opening he's drawing water in through. But being buried like this, not only is he concealed from predators, but he's also very well situated to ambush prey. So a little amphipod or a worm or something like that coming across the bottom in front of this guy, he'll pop up and eat it. These are really nasty little predators. You can see they're outfitted with a pretty good set of claws here. So this is a series I shot in an aquarium ages and ages ago, but it illustrates nicely kind of how these guys eat. So this is a different type of crangonid. This one doesn't bury. It's really well protected by having large spines all over it, and as you'll see, it blends in really well with its environment. But here's a little amphipod, kind of unaware of its fate. So he's got those claws like I just saw, like I just showed you on the previous slide, and they're sort of poised up here. And he's got a pair of legs that are adapted to function not as walking legs, but as antennae. And he's got them down here in the bottom. So when something bumps into those, he'll strike out with these claws and grab it. So he's grabbed this amphipod, and he stabs it a few times with his thumbs. Eventually he turns it so it's head first, because it'll go down easier that way. and he swallows it whole. Here you can see it inside his stomach. There's its eye, its head. It's all curled up in there. That's the way these crangonids eat things. They swallow everything whole. And here you can see what one of these guys looks like in the wild. Again, protected by the spines, but also just really well camouflaged. Here's a crangon his eyes are bigger than his stomach, obviously. He's got this big polychaete here, and he's swallowed a bunch of it, but there's got all this part that was still thrashing. That was the only reason I noticed him, was because this worm thrashing around. Okay, so we saw those guys. They had a pretty nasty set of claws on them, right? You look at a pendalid shrimp, though, something like this pink shrimp, and it's like, okay, sure, that guy was tough, he had those claws, but where are the claws on this guy? I mean, look at these wimpy little legs. This guy skipped leg day at the gym, right? Well, turns out these guys are pretty good little predators themselves. Here's one with a pretty large polychaete that it's caught and is eating. And this next video is really bad because it was like the very first digital camera I got, but it'll give you an idea of kind of the feeding frenzy sort of thing that can happen with these guys. So this was at night. This is in Discovery Bay. And you've got these shrimp that have come in, and there's a swarm of these worms, and you can see these guys. Here's several of them. They've got one here. Here's one that's got a worm here. I mean, these worms are bigger than the shrimp, and yet, you know, they were grabbing them out of the water column, and it was just thousands and thousands of shrimp and worms, and it was just this crazy frenzy going on. It was really amazing. But again, you know, who'd have thunk it? You know, these worms are fairly imposing, and these shrimp look like total wimps, right? Here's a dock shrimp. You go down to a marina at night, and shine a light on the pilings, you'll see these eyes glowing back at you. It's almost always going to be this kind of shrimp. Super, super common locally. Again, they got little tiny claws on one of the pairs of legs, but, you know, what could they do? What kind of damage could they do? Well, here's one that I came across that had just caught a newly molted porcelain crab. So the crab had just molted, so it was soft-shelled, okay? Crabs are fairly defenseless when they're newly molted like that, but even so, you'd think they'd be able to get away from something like a shrimp, right? He basically just got taken apart piece by piece with tiny little claws going into little parts and pulling out pieces of meat. He dispatched a live crab in very short order. So we have all kinds of cool little shrimp around here. I mean, super, super diverse group, and we don't know anything about the diet of pretty much any of them. But it stands to reason that a lot of these are predators on smaller things. I had a student that looked at one of our local tiny shrimps, a little intertidal shrimp, and found that the biggest component of its diet were chironomid larvae. So chironomids are midges. There's very few intertidal or marine insects, but there's a midge that has an intertidal larva that lives on the underside of rocks. And that was the main component of the diet of these things. But in terms of all the different worms and amphipods and things like that are out there, you know, there's a lot of different food sources out there, and we don't know what any of these guys are eating. So I just put them in to show pretty pictures of them, so an idea of the diversity of them. This isn't local. So when you get into the tropics, there are, you know, all kinds of relationships that we see in organisms that are kind of assumed to be tropical things. And one of those is cleaner shrimps and cleaning stations for fish. So if you're not familiar with it, there are cleaner gobies and cleaner wrasses, the little fish that set up a station, and larger fish will just line up to be groomed by these little guys, and they'll go over them and they'll pick off little parasites and things like that. And there's also shrimp that has set up a station, and they have these kind of white antennae usually. There's sort of a signal that, hey, I'm a cleaner, don't eat me. And fish will line up and the shrimp will crawl around, go in their mouths, do all this kind of stuff. We didn't know about any of that kind of thing for ages and ages. It wasn't until they did an underwater habitat down in the Bahamas or Florida or somewhere, and guys were staying down there for days at a time looking out the window and seeing these behaviors unfold before them. And since then, of course, there's been a lot of study on these things because, again, in the tropics, it's easy to spend a lot of time underwater. Around here, not so much. One of the shrimps that I had described a number of years ago, I named it a cleaner lebiad because it will go in the mouths of lingcod, rockfish, things like that, and clean them. So same behavior, but up here in cold, temperate waters. Here's a picture a friend of mine took, Neil McDaniel. Here's a cleaner lebiad on a lingcod. Another observation, so we have a group of fish called poachers. They're armor-plated fish. This is one of the more common, larger ones, sturgeon poacher. So these are very, like I say, armor-plated. They're like little crocodiles. And on a number of occasions, I've watched them as they will go up to a hermit crab or a shrimp and kind of force themselves on it. They'll present themselves in front of it. They'll turn sideways, and then the crab will start sort of poking at it, and the fish will just go stiff. And the crab will start picking away at it. And they'll roll it over, sometimes multiple times, and the fish will be just completely still, not do a thing. And it seems to me to be kind of a precursor to this sort of cleaning behavior. So here's another poacher, and you can see all these parasites on it here. So being armor-plated like they are, there's not much danger that they're going to get damaged by a crab or a shrimp picking away at their surfaces, but they are going to get cleaned. So again, this is something that is not made it into the literature, but it's out there, it's happening. Here's a spot shrimp, spot prawn. A lot of you guys have probably tasted these guys. They're very good shrimp, commercial and recreational fishery. And some interesting observations from the Seattle Aquarium. In the dome, they got this big underwater dome with a lot of different fish in it. They found that when they put spot shrimp in there, that the deeper water rockfish would go up and start presenting themselves to the shrimp. So things like a China rockfish wouldn't try to eat them. They would appear to be asking to be cleaned, whereas the shallow water rockfish that were in the tank, in the dome, would try to eat them. So for a long time, that was kind of the only observation we sort of had on this, but since then, Lee Newman, a former employee up at the Vancouver Aquarium, took this picture of a spot shrimp inside the mouth of a lingcod doing a cleaning job on its teeth. So all these things are happening here. It's just we don't know about them because it's too friggin' cold, right? I mean, it's not like you can stay down for as long as you can in the tropics. And so this assumption that all these complex relationships that are going on are the result. The explanation is always, well, the tropics have been stable for a longer period of time, so they've had more time for these things to develop. And instead, it's observer bias. These things are happening, we're not out there to see them. But nowadays with more and more technology in terms of remote cameras and recordings and things that we can do, we have a good opportunity to learn a lot more about kind of what's going on right out here under our noses. So a lot of times, a lot of you have heard about, this whole idea of crabs evolving and or animals evolving into the crab morphology, and we don't know why. It's gotten a lot of press, right? A lot of cartoons kind of showing up as a result. So getting back to my t-shirt, crabs don't get no respect. I mean, yeah, they are getting respect. But technically, don't get no is a double negative, right? So crabs are getting respect. So even though times have changed, the t-shirt is still valid. Now, it's like this quote, if we live out our span of life on Earth without ever knowing a crab intimately, we have missed having a jolly friendship. Life is a little incomplete if we can look back and recall these small people only as supplying a course after soup and with the chablis. These guys, I just love this because I've been watching these guys in tanks, in the wild, all this for most of my life, and they are a jolly friendship. As Diane mentioned, we have some books here, in particular the new Nudibranch book. You might want to avail yourself of that, hopefully. If you go to my website, molamarine.com, there's a free Northwest Sculpin identification guide and flatfish guides. They're PDFs, just free downloads, very handy for identifying those tough to identify groups of fishes.